I suppose from a British point of view, British perspective, it's an extraordinary time to release a book of this nature, given this desire within some parts of our population here in the UK to hark back to the glory days of empire and the glory days of Britain. Do you see that at all? Or have you seen that? Has the Daily Mail read the book at all?
Well, it is interesting because they had requested an interview, which they have since cancelled.
Oh.
So whether that means they've read the book and have cancelled, or they haven't read the book and that's why they're cancelling, I don't know. But that's okay. I've got more interviews than I have time, so I'm not too alarmed. But let me say that since I don't live here, I'm not caught up in the internal debates. I have, however, read sort of the last dozen years or so of what popular histories have been written out of Britain, and you're right, they're all celebrating empire, and this is very much a way of offering an alternative response to that way of understanding the world.
And on news programs in the last week, you've talked about how little there is, how little empire is talked about, particularly in schools. Is there also this week we've seen the release of a new film by Gurinder Chadha, which says that the partition of India wasn't actually planned in 1947, but it was planned well in advance, something that you alluded to during your seminar. Should there be a re-evaluation, not just of empire, but the figures that are associated with empire, particularly people like Winston Churchill?
Well, I certainly think Mr. Churchill needs very severe re-examination. He has as much blood on his hands as Hitler does, and particularly the decisions that he personally signed off on during the so-called Great Bengal Famine of 1943-44, when 4.3 million people died because of decisions that he took or endorsed, remains a permanent stain as far as I'm concerned, because not only did the British pursue their old policy of not helping victims of this famine, which they had been created by their policies, but Churchill persisted in exporting grain from Bengal to Europe, not to feed actual sturdy Tommies, to use his phrase, but to add to the buffer stocks that were being piled up in the event of a future invasion of Greece or Yugoslavia. Ships laden with wheat were coming in from Australia, docking at Calcutta, and were instructed by Churchill not to disembark but to sail on to Europe. And when conscience-stricken British officials from Calcutta wrote to the Prime Minister in London, pointing out that his policies were causing needless loss of life, all he could do was write peevishly in the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British persist in hailing as some sort of apostle of freedom and democracy, when to my mind he is really one of the more evil rulers of the 20th century, only fit to stand in the company of the likes of Hitler, Mao and Stalin.
And extraordinary that you mentioned during the talk that you see this as a version of a popular history and a version of history, and as opposed to a scholarly project. Did that cause any anxiety during the process at all? I mean, it's a remarkable turnaround from that speech at Oxford University to actually publishing the book, isn't it?
Well, it's not a turnaround. It's consistent with what I've said at Oxford. It's simply that I've amplified it. Right. What was a 15-minute speech has become a 330-page book. But in practice, it's the same arguments fleshed out, substantiated, added to and expanded. And of course, amply endnoted in case anybody doubts the facts that I've cited therein.
Right. Final question. Soon after that speech at the Oxford Union, Patrick French wrote a piece in The Spectator, I'm sure you've read that, saying that, no, Britain didn't plunder India, made a comparison with the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. How do you respond to that? And he also alluded to what's happened in India since independence. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's been so much written that I can't remember the exact details of his argument. If it is the argument that we missed the Industrial Revolution, so the British can't be blamed for us missing the Industrial Revolution, yes, they can be. As I say in the book, we missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution because you threw us under its wheels. There was systematic destruction of existing industry, thwarting of any prospect of growth of that industry, imposition of duties and tariffs on the export of Indian textiles and other goods, and the lifting of tariffs and duties on the import of British goods, so the British were able to acquire a market in India. as a result of these conscious policies, and to keep it as a captive market which had no choice but to buy European, specifically English goods. So as far as I'm concerned, that argument doesn't stand up. But in all fairness to Mr. French, who's a friend, I haven't recently reread his piece. That was 2 years ago almost. And so I don't remember whether that is an accurate summary of what his criticism was. As for the present day, nothing in my book excuses any of the failings of the present day. As far as I'm concerned, we are now masters of our own ship, and we should be responsible for how well it sails, in which direction it sails, whether it's leaking water. I mean, it's now up to us to get our own act together. And I certainly am not writing this book in order to provide excuses for any failures of the present. It is merely a way of giving you context and background, rather as any individual would like to know who their parents were, who their grandparents were. We as a collective civilization should know what our recent past was. Indians are all too quick to forgive and forget. I have no problem with forgiving. We should forgive, but I think it's important that we not forget.